Okay, good afternoon, everyone. This is Jim Rooney. I'm the President and CEO of the Greater Boston Chamber of Commerce. I'd like to welcome you to this call this afternoon with Udit Batra. On behalf of the Chamber team, we hope you're all joining us feeling safe and healthy as we at the Chamber, like you, continue to adapt to this unprecedented time. Our commitment is to serving our members as not only the voice of the region at the municipal, state, and federal level, but also to be a source of information and connection for the business community with leaders both in medicine and science and in business and commerce, so we can share information about how we're dealing with this COVID-19 crisis. Today's conversation is about COVID-19 with Dr. Udit Batra, the Chief Executive Officer of MilliporeSigma. I want to start with a few notes, including a very big thank you to Hinckley Allen, our partner in bringing relevant conversations like this to the business community. We're very appreciative of our continued partnership with Hinckley Allen at this time and then for many years at the Greater Boston Chamber of Commerce. I also want to let you know that this webinar is being recorded and will be shared on the Chamber's YouTube page shortly after the presentation. Be sure to submit your questions throughout the webinar using the Q&A feature, making sure to send your questions to all panelists. If you're dialing in, you can email questions to chamberprograms, one word, chamberprograms @bostonchamber.com. And with that, I'm pleased to introduce our guest speaker for this webinar. Udit Batra is the CEO of MilliporeSigma and a member of the Chamber's Board of Directors. Udit has dedicated his career to improving health for people globally with more than 20 years of experience in healthcare and the life sciences and in education and chemical engineering. Udit has previous experience working on vaccines and was a member of the team responsible for creating the H1N1 vaccine. Udit is an avid supporter of scientific education, oversees MilliporeSigma's key programs to spark scientific curiosity amongst school-age children. With that, I'll now turn it over to Udit.
Jim, thank you very much, and really thank you to all Chamber members for who are on the line for listening today. I hope I can share some ideas that will be useful to you, and I'm always curious to learn more. And really, Jim, thanks to the Chamber for also organizing such discussions. I've attended the previous ones, super helpful to hear from peers and others who are leading us through this pandemic. It's my pleasure to be here with you guys today. Let me start by telling you the story of one of our products. It's called an Amicon 15 centrifugal filter, which you can find now in virtually every testing lab globally. This device has a carefully designed membrane for use in clinical sample preparations that now include, among others, COVID-19 tests. As you know, the reliability of precise, accurate clinical testing are essential in these days, especially in public health. In the case of Amicon, the global implications of manufacturing and distribution of the product are just as significant as the clinical processes for which it is used. While it was originally designed and developed right here in Massachusetts, the Amicon 15 is a product now of a truly global supply chain. The membrane for this product is manufactured in New Hampshire. It's shipped to Cork, Ireland, where it passes into an automated device assembly that includes shaping by molds that are manufactured in China and from resins originating in Mexico. Having passed through high degree of inline inspection, the completed filters are then shipped to Taunton, right here in Massachusetts, and to Strasbourg, France, for distribution to end customers in many, many laboratories around the world. If you're counting, this product would have already crossed 6 borders multiple times to service the end customer in our globally connected supply chain. Our success today in fighting this pandemic relies deeply in our ability to share information and move such products seamlessly across national borders. If I leave you with one message and only one message today, it is that our strength in fighting this pandemic depends on our ability to work together openly and rapidly as a global family. Now, a bit about MilliporeSigma. We are the life science tools business of Merck KGaA, Darmstadt, Germany, a 70% family-owned company that has 3 businesses. Of these businesses, MilliporeSigma is the largest with about $7.5 billion in sales globally and 22,000 employees. The role of our company in the chemicals industry dates back to 1688. You heard that right, 1688. That is 352 years of continuous operation. The Merck family acquired Millipore back in 2010 to start its meaningful progress in the life science tools space. And in 2014, I had the privilege to take over as CEO. After a few months, we announced the acquisition of the technology and chemicals company known as Sigma Aldrich. And today, the combination of the two, MilliporeSigma, thus the name, includes 60 manufacturing sites that are located globally across all geographies, including the United States, UK, Germany, China, India, and many parts of Latin America. And our global supply chain serves leading manufacturers with over 300,000 products. We manufacture and supply tools and products and raw materials that are utilized for R&D, especially these days for vaccines, diagnostic kits, and potential therapeutics, especially for fighting the COVID-19 pandemic. Thus, our role in public health is undeniable. So with that, the importance of public health in mind, I will explore 3 topics today. The first one is our response to this pandemic. Second, I want to share with you how we are directing our innovation efforts to solving problems related to the pandemic. And I'll end with some personal reflections. Let's start with the response we've had to the pandemic. I have come to believe that in the face of a crisis or a transformation, an adherence to a simple 3-step process provides much needed structure and clarity necessary for successful resolution. First, one must identify and agree on clear priorities. Second, it is essential to establish a common understanding of the situation amongst all stakeholders. And lastly, it is key to execute a transparent and well-choreographed plan consistent with these priorities. So what are the priorities? With over 1,000 employees in China, some of our largest manufacturing and distribution investments in recent years, China is our fastest growing subsidiary. We determined back in January that the outbreak of COVID-19 had the potential of escalating into a global pandemic. 3 obvious priorities emerged. Number 1, ensuring the safety and well-being of our employees and their families. Number 2, making sure that we continue to play our role in public health. And number 3, we sustain our business well beyond this crisis in that order: employees, public health, and business continuity. These priorities got tested in the pandemic's very early move into Europe. On February 26, we learned that one employee's partner had received a positive diagnosis for COVID-19. Even with no confirmation that the employee might be infected, we immediately decided to close the building in which the employee worked, asked all 600 non-production employees to work from home, and traced those with whom the individual had made contact in other buildings on the campus. We knew that effectively closing a manufacturing site was a precedent-setting event. With employee safety as our top priority, there was but a singular right answer in this scenario. With the building shuttered, we scrubbed and disinfected it, ensuring that we maintained open lines of communication with our employees from the site. Upon reopening, we established clear social distancing rules that are now commonplace, that included, for example, an extra hour between 2 shifts to prevent any overlap, clear markers to delineate traffic flow and minimize unnecessary contact, and the division of the teams into independently functioning A and B shifts. Because some of the key components for diagnostic testing kits are made at the site, safely reopening was absolutely essential. And with success, we've repeated this process since at a few other sites. To remind you, this was back in late February. Having outlined just one example of our priorities in action, let me now talk through the process we use to manage this crisis on a day-to-day basis. We meet virtually 3 times a week for 1 hour as a COVID-19 executive team, twice a week with a broader group with close to 30 participants, and once a week with a closed leadership team. Twice a week, I also join our executive board that is largely based in Germany. So every day of the week, we meet as a top leadership group across the company to manage the COVID-19 pandemic. The executive team delivers on the 2 other principles that I mentioned for managing a crisis or a transformation: establishing a common understanding of the situation and designing a transparent management plan for execution. So our agenda for these meetings is rather straightforward, and it covers 4 primary questions consistent with our priorities. To establish a common understanding, we ask ourselves, what is the current state of the pandemic from an epidemiological perspective, and what is the public health response globally? You'll agree with me that with so much disparate information regarding the spread and effectiveness of the interventions readily available, it is important for us to have one source of truth amongst us. So a few like-minded colleagues and I have a journal club in our company that reads papers. It scours the virtual universe and shares information daily so we can present to our teams a common view on the developments in diagnosis, treatments, and vaccines, and general developments in public health related to COVID-19 pandemic. Second, we ask, how are our employees faring in the hotspots that are revealed through this investigation? We review the key sites, the possible cases, and the mitigation plans, not dissimilar to what I mentioned to you earlier. Thirdly, our scope then returns to our products and to public health. What is the status of our products that are needed for key diagnostics, treatments, and vaccines? You might imagine there are products for which the demand has risen dramatically and well beyond our ability to supply, even if we had 100% productivity. An example is right here in Danvers, Massachusetts. We are a leading supplier of single-use assemblies for biological processing. With the increased demand, we implemented approaches to increase our capacity, including parts to rapidly commissioning new space and procuring more raw materials. I must say a big thank you that in this endeavor, we work very closely with the governor's office here in Massachusetts, as well as many government officials, and each and every person, I must say, has been quick and highly focused in the response to collectively do what we can to ensure public health. I'm deeply impressed with the commitment of each and every person we've encountered in this crisis. Lastly, in these discussions, my colleagues and I ask, how can we sustain our business well beyond this pandemic? How is our supply chain performing, and what is the financial health of the business? We explored many metrics from a supply chain perspective, but the 2 that I find most useful for daily evaluation are the number of products shipped and the number of new orders placed. For example, in a 4-week period in China in the early stages of the pandemic, we saw the number of products shipped to almost 0. Within 2 weeks after that, the product shipped started to pick up, and roughly 8 weeks from the beginning of the pandemic, the shipment rates to most industrial customers have returned to expected levels. Orders placed is a leading indicator, and it reveals an even more interesting trend. In China, we first saw a drop in orders, and they only continue to be placed by essential government labs. After a 6-week slowdown, many more orders, well above what we were seeing in last year, has now started to indicate a strong return, especially in labs and plants that are serving the COVID-19 pandemic, especially production of vaccines and production of diagnostics. Such a specific process and insight reveals an insight that basically poses another question that is worthy of exploration. How do you most effectively allocate scarce product? Here too, we have established very clear principles where products on allocation are prioritized first for COVID-19 needs and for life-saving treatments, followed by any other contracted needs. Many of our customers understand this prioritization under the circumstances. To the person, each and every one of our customers has worked in collaboration with us to ensure that this allocation process is rightly followed and delivered. With COVID-19 having emerged as a public health crisis of our time, we have followed this finely structured response with very clear priorities that begins with employee safety and the needs for public health. From here, we have unfolded a transparent and structured process that I just took you through that emerges from the creation of a common understanding of the situation. Let me now turn to the second part of my monologue, innovation during this crisis. We've seized this opportunity to galvanize our global R&D organization by convening what we call is our innovation board, the top R&D leaders at MilliporeSigma. In addition, we invited 30 additional biologists, chemists, data scientists, and engineers from across the organization. We asked ourselves, how can MilliporeSigma, or the life science tools business of Merck KGaA, accelerate contributions to resolve the COVID-19 pandemic and mitigate any collateral effects in the future? Let me repeat. How can MilliporeSigma accelerate contributions to resolve the COVID-19 pandemic and mitigate any collateral effects in the future? In doing so, we've delineated our potential contribution of over 100 ideas into 7 different categories. The ideas range from faster point-of-care testing to air quality sampling in public transportation, to CRISPR gene editing library screens for new therapies, to technologies to more rapidly scale up manufacturing of vaccines and treatments, and many, many others. The need is urgent, and open science with rigor and trusted data, I believe, is the path to success. We will soon have defined a precise path forward, and we will issue a call to collaborators to join us globally so that we can solve these problems as fast as possible. We're going to do all we can to end this pandemic and work towards preventing others in the future, and I hope many of you will join us in any way you can. Let me now end with some personal reflections. First, in this time of so many sources of information and so many more people telling us how to interpret this information, I found that reading primary literature and debating it with others who have done the same to be the most valuable source of insight. So I read a lot of primary literature, and my journal club is one of my refuges from an endless day of meetings. Second, with back-to-back virtual meetings that leave really no white space on my calendar, I find that preserving my time to reflect, to run, to meditate, and to spend time with my family all the more important. It is in these times that I can reflect on the information and insights that I gather from my journal club, from my team, from customers, from stakeholders, and many more that I listen to during the day. Thirdly, and finally, armed with these insights, I force myself these days to write down my reflections about what we need to do to make sure that we establish a common and trusted understanding of the spread of the disease and its impacts much faster than we've been able to do to date. Second, what would be helpful in the infrastructure so that we do not have to struggle with the scarcity that we do, especially in the case of manufacturing of capacity of key raw materials in our case. And finally, what can we do to nurture innovation that addresses the challenges of our time? More on that in coming days. Let me end this monologue where I started. I am deeply, deeply convinced that we will address the challenges posed by this pandemic if we work closely together as a global family. Remember the story of that Amicon device. It took a 100 nanometer particle to remind us that our survival and prosperity depended on global collaboration. Thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to take any questions at this point.
Well, thank you, Udit, and we do have a number of questions. This has turned into quite a popular call. We have about 200 people listening in. Let me begin just exploring a little more deeply. You mentioned that one of your keys within MilliporeSigma to developing your response tactics is getting to a common understanding of the situation or the context on an ongoing basis, and your tactics, including your journal club, was one of the ways that you do it. I'm sure the audience would like to know, within your thinking, what is the current context? What is the current status of this pandemic?
I think, Jim, thank you for the question. I've only based this on my latest understanding of of the context, I mean, as you know, the pandemic has spread across the globe, and if you just stay with the U.S. for a minute, it's expected to peak in mid-April to end April, in many parts of the country towards late April. And you hear the public prognostications of almost 100,000 deaths. I hope it is much, much lesser. In my view, there are several assumptions that underlie these projections. One of them is, and then this is the most important one in my view, is the asymptomatic transmission of the disease. We today have really no good handle on this particular metric, and if you just think about it, I mean, if 1 in 5 people have an asymptomatic progression of disease, that is, they've been infected, we just never knew, and now they're better. That's very different than having 4 in 5 people with that sort of situation. That's the single, in my view, single largest unknown factor. Second, so once we're able to get a better understanding of that, we will be in a better situation to understand when the new normal will progress. But in our best understanding, and we listen to government officials, we listen to a lot of what the CDC, the WHO has to say, and read a lot of the primary literature. In our best understanding, we are still about 6 to 12 months away from returning to what would be considered a somehow subdued normal. It will still require a lot of vigilance, and this assumes that not the whole population has been through the infections, and there is still a larger population that still has to go through the infection. So there is not herd immunity, and we can expect a small outburst of the infection. But that said, I mean, the goal right now is to suppress the infection rate as much as we can, so the public health system can handle it, and we have enough time to produce treatments and vaccines and get tests permeated across the country. But in a nutshell, our view is it's still another 6 to 12 months of being very vigilant while treatments, vaccines, and diagnostics are being developed.
Thank you. Udit, I mentioned your educational training, both PhD and BS in chemical engineering, and your experience working on the vaccines for the vaccine for the H1N1 virus. There's a lot of information out there about the search for a vaccine for COVID-19. A lot of research going on, a lot of tests going on, and varying time periods when something may be available. What are you hearing that's promising? What are your thoughts on time period for the development of a vaccine?
I mean, Jim, I'll remind you, we are a supplier into vaccine companies. We're very well aware of what's happening with many of our customers, and we serve over 35 vaccine developers, virtually everybody who's trying to develop a treatment or an antiviral. So we have an understanding of what people are seeing and feeling. First, I'm deeply, deeply impressed with the speed at which the first vaccine made it into people within 63 days from sequence to first human dosing. I mean, that's a terrific and exhilarating record. That said, I mean, vaccine development is a long-term process, and it's still 18 months to 2 years away that we have a vaccine. And I'm not an expert in this area, but I can say that it's going to take that much time. There is a lot more optimism that an antiviral would start to work sooner, and there are quite a few that are being tested. So my hope is that at least one of them works, and we at least have something that can slow down the progression of the symptoms for many of the people who are experiencing them. And finally, the third prong is testing kits. I mean, we have kits, but I think the bigger breakthrough will be when we have serological testing that's widely available, so we can understand who has developed antibodies. So since there is so much asymptomatic transmission, so simply said, the closest is likely a serological test, so we know who's been infected. Second, I would say we would have clinical results from treatments, and third, I would say is vaccines. Of course, vaccines is the ultimate solution, but I think that's the slowest out of all of them. Comparing to H1N1, since you brought it up, I mean, I did not think that in my career, within a 10-year period, within a decade, I would see two pandemics and be deeply involved in resolving and responding to them. This itself is a sign, and many experts have told us that there would be pandemics, and this is a sign, and we need to think through how our public health systems are going to respond to many such challenges if they come in the future. But I mean, it is absolutely exhilarating to watch all the people work in this setting. Least of all, not to exclude the folks who are working in our company, who collaborated with virtually every customer, rapidly gone back to work even after we've cleaned up sites, and really made sure that we deliver for public health. So yeah, I mean, that's a long answer, but I'd say vaccines are the longest way out.
Yeah. I want to explore a little bit. You mentioned closing the manufacturing facility based on information that one employee had been exposed. There was a swift and dramatic reaction on behalf of the priority you mentioned, which is the safety of your employees. But I'm sure it was done with knowledge that the reaction had to be one that was dramatic in that fashion. And then we look at the way across the globe that countries are reacting. Taiwan and New Zealand come to mind. Article in today's Washington Post that New Zealand has not just flattened the curve, it's squashing the curve because they just locked down. They took dramatic action. What are your thoughts on that? As a company, and given the leadership of MilliporeSigma, they decided that back in, I think you said it was February, we have to close this building. Why make that decision so dramatically?
Yeah, so Jim, I mean, it goes back to the priorities, right? I mean, basically, the first and most important thing is health of our employees. We knew for certain that the spouse of one of our employees was infected. We didn't know if the spouse was infected, but we imagined the worst case scenario and said, okay, let's shut it down and clean up the site because it's a precedent-setting event. And again, you're challenged in these moments, and the priorities gave us clarity, right? So we said, you know what, employee safety is number one, so we send everybody home. Now let's scrub the site. We also knew that the site is absolutely essential for producing components for diagnostic kits that everybody was waiting for. So we had to bring people back, and we had to be sure that we brought them back under safer conditions. So I don't think, once the priorities were clear, the decision was not as difficult as you just outlined. I think the other piece to consider is, and once you set the precedent, that's exactly what you have to follow. We've done the same in Danvers, where we found one or two people that might have been infected. We suspected that it might be infected. We shut the site down, cleansed it, and now brought people back with a completely different sort of social distancing implemented. The sites are not operating at 100% capacity anymore because we have basically distanced people, and instead of 100%, they're operating, let's say, at 80%. And that poses some challenges on capacity for the future. But that said, I think a dramatic action, as many countries have shown now, also in retrospect. In February, we had no clue, right? I mean, we simply knew these were our priorities, right? We had no clue if this was the right decision, wrong decision, but it was clear with our priorities that this is what was consistent with what we had said. But now, since then, all the data that is available suggests that a dramatic response is the best one to suppress the progression of the disease and the progression of the infection amongst people, and then being able to handle it step by step. So we needed the time to ensure that we had developed a system, a process to handle the infections, and I think we are better off. I mean, I'll remind you, we have over 50 manufacturing sites spread all over the globe. And so the principles are really, really critical. And I think that's at least I feel it's the right approach until we understand much, much more about the disease.
Yeah. You mentioned in your opening that the key is the ability to work together openly and rapidly, and certainly MilliporeSigma has done that, forming the COVID-19 task force within the company and dedicated COVID-19 web page that everyone can go look at and look at products and information that's available. I want to explore, given all of the products and the labs and so forth that you service, we're seeing on the approved medical side, the treatment side, that drugs are being repurposed. Are you finding that some of your products and supplies are being used in different ways in this circumstance?
That's a great question. I mean, there are maybe three categories of products. Right? So the first that are just basically because of the increased demand for vaccines and treatments, where the demand for those products has gone through the roof. And I mentioned one in my opening. These are single-use assemblies. There's a second, and there's about 150, 200 products in that category. There's a second category which, people are actively trying to repurpose them from research use to clinical use, or repurpose them from one type of test to another. So, for instance, our high-flow membranes and beads for flu A/B rapid test are now being repurposed for SARS-CoV-2 rapid point-of-care tests. Right? It's a mouthful, but simply said, products that were used for one type of diagnostic test are now being rapidly tested for others, just like you see in treatments. And there's quite a few such products in that category. And then there's a third set, which are, I would say, in the bullpen, right, that could potentially be repurposed. I mean, there are research use only, but we are getting demands and requests from many customers with backing of regulatory authorities around the globe to try them for clinical use. And there, of course, one is very cautious, right? I mean, you don't want research use products to be used for treatments and clinical purposes without passing through all the right sort of regulatory requirements. So those are the three categories. I can tell you, I mean, there's about 700 products across these three categories that we review in these COVID calls every week. And we say, okay, which ones are on allocation, which one's going to be repurposed, and there's a ton of discussion with our customers. And one has to, again, follow a principle-based approach. I mean, under what conditions would we allow people to use the product? Second, under what conditions will we expand capacity? How do we expand capacity? And those kinds of discussions are very normal.
Okay. Udit, we have a business question about your sales and, how do you anticipate sales to be in the second quarter and beyond? Quarters three and four.
Sorry for the laugh.
No, I thought it was. We have an audience question.
No, it's totally fine. I get it. It's a logical question. The reason I laugh is, there is a lot of uncertainty. And let me give you a little bit of color. Firstly, as a public company, I can't tell you, even if I knew what the second quarter was going to look like. I mean, we give our guidance, and that is a process we follow. So I would not be able to do that anyway. But I can give you the underlying drivers. I can talk about the underlying drivers. So let's take a couple of examples, right? I already mentioned that for bioprocessing products like single-use assemblies, like cell culture media, these are products that are used for vaccine and NAB and monoclonal antibody development, both for COVID as well as other life-saving treatments. Those products are going through the roof. I mean, we really are contemplating how we're going to expand capacity in Danvers and Jaffrey, New Hampshire. And we're working with the local government officials to find extra space to qualify it rapidly. Like you see hospitals getting qualified, we need space being qualified so that we can meet the needs of all these vaccines that are coming through and treatments that are coming through. That part of the portfolio is doing very, very well, and we are under immense pressure to meet the needs for our customers. Then if you go to the other extreme, you're well aware that most universities have sent people home. Lab experiments have, especially if they're not related to COVID-19 and their long-term research experiments, have come to a halt. right? I mean, some universities, I was told, are operating at 1 to 2% of their total capacity. So the academic buying of reagents has really taken a hit. We saw this early on in China. In China, it started to get offset by government labs and others who started to experiment. So I'm deeply convinced that the products will be used, but by different type of customers and also for different type of users. That starts to give you a flavor from a portfolio of products, so the portfolio and customer perspective, right? So products that are used for production of vaccines, treatments for COVID are going up nicely. Products that are used for long-term research in academic labs are not necessarily flying off the shelf at this time. And then geographically, basically, it is moving in waves. I mean, what we saw in China, and I was rather precise with my timing there. It is true that within 6 weeks, from start to finish, we saw orders go to zero and come back to normal, right? And in certain portfolios, they are well above what they were last year. So it's a 6 to 8 week process when different countries are coming back to, I would say, a new level of normal for them, right? And I think that's what we're seeing across geography. That it went from China to Europe, now in the United States. You see the same sort of trend.
Yeah. Udit, you maybe this is a related question for MilliporeSigma. You mentioned the intensity of the COVID-19 response within MilliporeSigma, including in the innovation space. And you talked about the allocation of scarce product and how you're thinking about that. But both people and companies only have so much bandwidth. So does this moment focused on the coronavirus change the focus of research from other areas for MilliporeSigma?
I think excellent question, Jim. A maybe three-part answer. First, there is no doubt that virtually everyone who's living in these times, especially in a company like ours, is thinking, what more can I do? And you wake up and you meet a MilliporeSigma, or I would say any sort of healthcare employee, especially in this area, in the Boston area, I think to the person, everyone will say, what can I do with my skills? I know something in this space that can help. So our innovation board, which is the top committee that we have, that basically brings together all R&D heads, we expanded it. Basically, this was the number one question that we asked: what can we do to help? That, of course, means that certain other programs will slow down. And I'll remind you that not many people can go into the lab right now, right? Because of the rules that we have, right? So people have time to now think through we can construct. We can do all the literature reviews and all the construction of problems and collaborations, so that when we go back to the lab, we can first focus on the COVID problems, and then definitely some of the other programs will be delayed because there's only a certain number of resources. So definitely that is happening, and that will happen. We don't see the impact of that yet, partly because people are not back in the labs, but the prioritization is real. The other thing that I would point out, so those are the first 2 points, right? So yeah, I mean, there is a lot of very significant amount of richness, and I mentioned some of those ideas, right? I mean, how can we repurpose our CRISPR gene editing library screens for new therapies, especially for COVID? How can we come up with better ways of rapidly scaling up vaccines and treatments in real time, right? So our people are dedicated to that. And there's a whole bunch of examples of this kind. But then I also I sit on the advisory council of a couple of universities, my two alma maters, Princeton and Delaware. And I've heard from both of them that, of course, PhD students have gone home or are not back in the labs. And you have some really talented students who are now in many universities asking the same question. So there is a lot of capacity. So when we talk about not enough resource, there is a lot of resource, and there's a lot of very smart people. As soon as we can figure out how to bring them back into the workforce, I have no doubt that we will have more hands than ideas to progress things forward. So I see in the short term, we will be constrained by our own sort of resource load, but I have no doubt that if we tap into the broader community, which is the intent, we'll be able to solve these problems, not just our own short-term problems, but also the midterm problems related to COVID.
Udit, I'd like to explore a little bit MilliporeSigma as both a global supplier and a global employer. Let's start with supplier first. You've mentioned the Amicon 15 story about crossing, I think you said 6 borders before it returned for distribution. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe you're operating in 66 countries and with 60 manufacturing sites. So that's already a complex operation under any circumstances. But with a global pandemic, I'm sure there are added difficulties. Talk about fulfilling requests and orders and getting your own supplies, crossing so many borders and with different regulations perhaps in place now than were before.
Yeah, no, I think this is a full-time job of many people. With over 300,000 products crossing multiple borders all the time. It is. I would again say, look, one has to first have a common understanding of the situation, right? So we can't solve all of those problems all at the same time. The crisis is moving, or the pandemic is moving from one geography to the other, and virtually the same thing emerges with minor changes, right? So each country looks at the crisis and closes their borders and says, okay, transportation will not be allowed, this will not be allowed, that will be not allowed. The same playbook applies, right? So you go to the government officials like we did in the U.S., and we are mostly qualified as an essential product, especially for public health need. And virtually every government official, as soon as they hear that, they help us resolve any of these border closing issues. But it creates a short-term challenge. I mean, it did in Europe, and there were long lines. Initially, when the pandemic reached Europe, when the freight capacity initially dropped, some airlines are operating at 5% of their global capacity now, right? I mean, that has dramatic implications when you're using that supply chain. But we were able to negotiate a priority with most of them. We have deep relationships with the carriers. We were able to negotiate a priority on their cargo plane on their cargo planes. For trucks crossing different borders, we were able to negotiate with trucking companies as an essential product, and we got help from government officials. As I mentioned, Governor Baker and his administration have been super helpful in Massachusetts, as have been the other states. So the playbook is rather similar. You have to solve it once, and then you have to go from one country to the other to make sure that you do the same things. Requires deep relationships with the logistics industry, requires respect and relationship with the people who are trying to determine what products go where, and requires a deep collaboration also with the government officials. And so the collaboration, as I mentioned, is key, right, across the board. And then secondly, despite what we hear from many politicians, I mean, the borders are not closing, not these kind of products, right? So we have managed to make sure that supply chain runs somehow now much more smoothly than initially, but much more smoothly now. And as I said, we monitor products shipped from each of our warehouses and orders placed for each of our products at a very granular level. So we and you might read about them in other sources. So yeah, those are some general principles. I'm happy to elaborate more if you have more questions.
Well, I want to shift to now being a global employer, and is it? I believe it's 20,000 employees. Is that right?
Yeah, just over 20,000. Yeah, 22,000.
So 20,000 employees during a global pandemic. Throughout your opening remarks, you emphasize the safety of your employees, and in your personal reflections, you shared some of your own behaviors in terms of maintaining your own mental health. So I guess a two-part question. Talk about the importance of maintaining that sort of mental health and stability. during these times for everybody? And how do you spread that advice to 20,000 employees?
It's a great question, and it's not solely my task. We have a huge team that works on this all together, and my leadership team takes personal ownership of making sure that each and every one of our employees feels the pride that we do right now to serve the needs of public health. It's not a difficult exercise, Jim, when you have the purpose that we do, right? So it's not really difficult to tell people why it matters. Everyone understands, and to the person, everyone wants to go out of their way to help. The challenge is just the opposite: to make sure that people follow the local regulations and are not doing silly things to get to the plants and getting to the office. So we really have to be stringent to make sure that people are following those rules, number one. Number two, and you touched upon this, is to create structure, but also take advantage of the chaos. So structure meaning we have these calls, as I mentioned, 3 times a week with my leadership team, twice a week with the board. And there's a cascade of calls that people have. So there's structure, probably more structure than we used to have when we were in the offices. But you need a little bit of freedom in that structure as well, right? So the structure allows us to manage things rather militaristically, but there is chaos around it. Everything is moving left and right. So how do you ensure that people have enough time and force people to spend time thinking about things? And I share what I do, and different people do different things. And I can share a couple of interesting examples of what my colleagues are doing. Some like cooking, and they exchange photographs of cooking. And I try to cook once in a while, and I think I have more and more credibility in that space, but not enough to be in the kitchen a lot these days. But my colleagues share that, right? They have kids. I mean, once in a while you have somebody's kid sitting on their lap, and they were not on video once. And I said, okay, let's everybody get on video. I just want to see how everybody looks. And people are like, come on, we shouldn't do it. And I hadn't shaved for 4 days, and some others hadn't done anything. And then one of my colleagues had a child in their lap and said, oh, wait, I got to put him aside. No, so we want to see him. Right? So you take advantage of chaos to create a bit of distance from the stress that's being created. And I tell you, the best discussions happen then. Right? You've led teams. I mean, the best discussions happen when you had rigorous discussions, so everybody understands what you're trying to do, and then you create somehow a relaxed environment. And I find, it's no different than face-to-face meetings on that front, just having a bit of levity, bit of freedom. And then finally, the last piece is a serious situation. All of us know people who've been affected, right? And we want to make sure that we take it seriously. So we lead that by example. And I've given you a whole set of thoughts. I didn't want to structure it too much, just to tell you that, look, it's a bit of structure, but it's a lot of ensuring that the right spirit is maintained. So we serve public health, but we allow ourselves to take advantage of the chaos. And this is true across the globe. So when you said, well, you're a global company, do you have global rules on this? Not at all. Not at all. The structure of serving, there's a purpose. The structure of getting the supply chain working is there. But we leave our teams alone to manage their cultural environment as they see fit. And this I insist on. We have very smart leaders. We have people who've done an incredible job during the pandemic, as long as they know the purpose and they know the frame. They have freedom within the frame to run their teams as they like. And we found wonderful examples of how people have done that across the world, right? So that's been terrific as well.
Right. Udit, just watching television, we've heard that hospitals are in need of certain products, ventilators, PPE. Within your customer and client base and the products you supply, what are the high demand products, and are there products? I know you also supply PPE to people who work in laboratories. Are there products that are in high demand and you're finding it difficult to supply in the quantities people want?
Less on the PPE side, Jim. We're not the biggest supplier in that space, but more so for products for diagnostic kits especially as serological assays get developed. A few manufacturers who have qualified the production of antigens, the production of membranes. Those products are in super, super high demand. There are vaccines manufacturers who are starting to move forward with their programs, and a couple of them are very public. I'm not at the liberty of talking about the customers' names, but they're all over the news, and we are one of the largest suppliers in that space. And already our Banff site, our site, which produces filters, our Irvine, Kansas, Irvine, Scotland, and the next Kansas sites, which produce cell culture media. I can go on, and our service labs in Washington D.C. and Glasgow, Scotland, and in Singapore. These are in very, very high demand. Daily conversations with customers to prioritize, and sometimes it's going back to the same customer saying, "Hey, I wanted to prioritize this, but we need to prioritize something else, and can we do it together?" Right? Even for that same customer, but sometimes it's outside their hands, and we basically use our judgment, and I've been on calls with CEOs of these companies as well to discuss how we can reprioritize certain things with them. Yeah.
Udit, it's getting toward the end of the hour, and I'll close with one question and then maybe ask you to make some closing remarks. Looking forward, we're all hopeful. We hear discussions about the peak, at least here in Massachusetts, being somewhere between April 10th and April 20th. I want to talk a little bit about or ask your views on the circumstances under which we begin to return to something that is near normal in terms of the conduct of business and commerce. When will it be right to do that? I'm sure people listening and many people that are working from home and whose businesses are closed are anxious to get up and running again. What kind of things would you look for to say, you know what, it's okay? And I guess part two of that question is, having the experience of closing and reopening a factory, people are going to be hesitant to return to gathering, to return to their workforce. You've done it already. You've reopened a manufacturing facility. How do you instill confidence in people that it's okay, given the experience we're all going through?
It's the question of our times, Jim. It's a balance between an understanding of where the disease is and how widely it's spread. How much have we controlled it? Right? I think the fundamental question and the fundamental assumption is, have we as a public health system gotten to a point where we can control the spread and the implications of the disease, right? I think that's the fundamental topic. And if our public health system is able to cope with it, then at least we know that with a certain degree of discipline, we can come back into some level of normalcy. I would call it 100% normal. Then the second question, and then you ask, okay, so how do you make sure that this happens? One, you look at the data, right? There's a lot of data emerging in different geographies. You pay attention, and this is, again, I re-emphasize that we are a global family. Look at what's happening in Singapore. Look at what's happening in Taiwan. Look at what's happening in Japan. When there is reemergence of infections, what is the source? Where did it come from? How did we contain it again? So there's a huge amount of information that needs to be parsed out into simple messages. And I think there, I would simply be looking for our ability to cope with the infections, even if there is a steady rate of infections. As a public health system, can we cope with it, right? Do we have enough ICU beds? Do we have enough PPE? I think that would be one thing I would look for, and be able to deal with any small spikes so that there's not an explosion again. That would be one thing I would look for, and there is a lot of data emerging to be able to get to that point. The second is, how do you give people confidence? You give people confidence by being transparent, being totally transparent with the facts, right? When the employee, as I talked about in our first site, that their spouse was suspected to have the COVID infection, we told the employees inside why we were doing what we were doing. We told them what we were doing. We told them when they would come back, under what conditions they would come back, and employees problem solved a lot of this on their own. I mean, people have come up with ways of what we're calling social distancing now, but ways of keeping distance a while ago. And I think transparency is critical, and having a bit of humility during these times to not act like we know everything. I mean, this is a virus, and the virus has I mean, we can have the need to come back and grow the economy again. Yes, we all do, and we understand the implications of staying out of the workforce. All of us do for the certain parts of the economy. But the virus also has a certain approach, right? I mean, it is spreading at a certain rate. It's causing the disease in a certain rate. It has certain underlying transmission approaches. So we have to balance those two things, and I think there is enough data that is emerging that will help us make that decision. And as I said earlier, I think we will be able to come back. I'm absolutely optimistic. We will be able to come back with a more cautious approach, but as long as we are transparent. I have seen wonderful decision making from many of my colleagues and many of my fellow citizens. So I have no doubt we will do the right thing if we're provided with the data, right? So long way of saying that I'm optimistic we'll definitely be coming back within the next 6 to 12 months in rather a controlled approach. We will come back sooner, but it will be a controlled approach for the next 6 to 12 months. That's my thinking today.
Great. Well, Udit, thank you so much for spending this hour with us. It's been a very informative conversation. I know that everyone on the call joins me in thanking Dr. Udit Batra for sharing these insights. Before I close, I do want to highlight for our audience the information on the Chamber's COVID-19 Business Resource page. You can learn more about the activities at the federal, state, and local government levels, as well as updates regarding our upcoming virtual conversations. And all of that is at bostonchamber.com. We do have another virtual program coming up tomorrow, Wednesday, April 8th at 9 a.m. We'll hear from the District Director of the U.S. Small Business Administration, Bob Nelson, and his deputy, Peter Contakos, and they'll provide us with an update on the CARES Act and how the implementation of the small business loan programs are going, and answer questions for anyone who may need to take advantage of those programs. You can register for this program and more by visiting bostonchamber.com. Once again, thank you to Dr. Udit Batra and MilliporeSigma for sharing such insights and information to all of us. And once again, thank you all for joining us, and stay healthy.
Thank you, Jim.
Thank you. Signing off.